Hey everyone, welcome back to MangaMinute. I'm thrilled to share my latest recap video with you. If you missed the previous one, no worries, just take a quick peek in the description below for the link. Now, let's dive right in and enjoy.
Lu Ping swung his sword in a steady rhythm, though his movements lacked their usual precision. His thoughts were adrift, weighed down by frustration and confusion. How had everything spiraled so quickly out of control? The once clear path before him had become clouded, and no matter how he tried to focus, the nagging doubts crept into his mind, throwing him off balance. Elizabeth watched him from a distance, her sharp gaze catching the lapse in his form. The air around her bristled with authority, an unspoken command demanding discipline. She was not one to tolerate distractions, especially during training, and her silent presence alone served as a constant reminder for him to sharpen both his skills and mind. With renewed effort, Lu Ping tightened his grip on the sword and resumed his practice. The blade sliced through the air, but his earlier hesitation still lingered. Elizabeth sipped her drink leisurely, her sharp gaze fixed on Lu Ping as he trained. A subtle smirk curled her lips as she pondered the recent turn of events. She saw through his actions with an air of victory, amused by the transparent games he attempted to play with her. He might be slightly more powerful than her in raw strength, but when it came to strategy, knowledge, and understanding the human psyche, he was no match for her. His words from that morning still echoed in her mind, the moment when he had asked her to leave, only to reveal, in his own way, how deeply attached he had become. She had seen it clearly, that crack in his resolve, that unspoken admission that he could not live without her. Elizabeth relished the power she held over him. Their combined might was undeniable. If they wished, they could either rule or destroy the world with a single thought. Yet, she understood that such pursuits held little meaning for them. The world would continue to evolve, whether they interfered or not, and it was far more interesting to observe it from a distance, playing their roles as necessary. As she watched him train, Elizabeth knew that Lu Ping's restless thoughts had led to his actions earlier that day. His suggestion that she should leave and rule on her own had been nothing more than a flimsy pretense, a clumsy attempt to capture her attention. He was distracted, uncertain, and she saw through it all. His feelings had grown over the past year, and it was clear to her now. He had fallen for her, though perhaps he had not fully realized it yet. She savored the knowledge, knowing that, despite his wandering thoughts and confused heart, she remained firmly in control. Even the matter of the Dark Guild had already been resolved by Amelia, leaving no distractions for them to hide behind. Lu Ping gripped the sword tightly, his mind swirling with doubt as he reflected on the teachings he had heard. The idea that one could master the blade simply by swinging it 1,000 times a day seemed far too simplistic. Could mastery really be achieved through repetition alone? Elizabeth sat in quiet contemplation, her thoughts wandering to the strange dynamic between her and Lu Ping. Despite being at the pinnacle of strength, there was a part of her that reveled in the fact that she alone could control him. A hero with such wicked interests, unmatched in power and creativity, yet somehow tethered to her. Though she had no interest in the trivial matters of love, she couldn't deny the intrigue when it came to him. His abilities in creation and production were unmatched, while her own mastery of swordsmanship and magic was unrivaled. Together, their union would be formidable. Her mind began to drift to the future, and a curious thought took hold. What kind of child could the two of them create? A child who could break the very limits of this realm, one whose strength could surpass even their own. Was that his true intention, to create a being more powerful than either of them? Elizabeth smirked, knowing she wouldn't agree so easily to such an idea. She decided she would let him continue honing his swordsmanship first, enjoying the thought of him trying to perfect what she already considered subpar. Her laughter echoed in the air, amused by the thought of him needing to get stronger for some potential child in the future. Meanwhile, Lu Ping, deep in his own thoughts, wondered about Elizabeth's true intentions. Was she really planning to teach him swordsmanship and magic so he could defeat the Dark Guild? Her motivations were often shrouded in mystery, and he found it difficult to unravel what she truly desired. Suddenly, the holy sword he held exploded in a burst of light. As the smoke cleared, the sword was gone, and in its place stood a boy. Shocked by the transformation, Lu Ping stared in disbelief, struggling to comprehend what had just happened. The boy, standing confidently in the aftermath of the explosion, wasted no time in asserting his presence. He was no ordinary child. He was the sword spirit of the Holy Sword, the embodiment of its majestic power. Hearing the sudden commotion, Elizabeth rose from her seat, her eyes narrowing in suspicion. The air around her shifted, and her gaze quickly landed on the figure causing the disturbance. The boy, Alpha, immediately recognized her presence, his expression hardening at the sight of the demon queen. Without hesitation, he lunged at her, his body a blur as he launched a direct attack, intent on her destruction. Elizabeth, however, remained entirely unfazed. Her calm demeanor never wavered as she watched him approach with deadly intent. In a swift, effortless motion, she raised her leg and delivered a single powerful kick. The boy was sent flying through the air, his assault easily thwarted as if it were nothing more than a passing breeze. With the same composed authority, Elizabeth's voice cut through the tension, her words steady and controlled. There was no hint of urgency, no anger, just cold command as she addressed the boy. The battle, it seemed, was already over before it had even begun. Seated across from one another, Lu Ping's expression was filled with regret as he reflected on the events that had just transpired. He offered an apology to Alpha, the sword spirit, acknowledging his ignorance over the past year. Despite wielding the holy sword for so long, he had never realized that the being within it had been conscious all along. Alpha, however, was far from appeased. His tone was sharp, irritation laced in every word as he recounted his experience. He reminded Lu Ping that his purpose had been to manifest at the most critical moment of the hero's battle against the demon queen, not to endure the mundane tasks to which he had been subjected. For an entire year, he had been reduced to nothing more than a tool for chopping firewood. The indignity of it was unbearable. In Alpha's eyes, Lu Ping had not only abandoned the script by forging a friendship with Elizabeth, but had also insulted the very essence of the holy sword by using it for such menial labor. To Alpha, this betrayal of purpose rendered Lu Ping unworthy of his title as a hero. Elizabeth, sensing the tension between them, intervened with her usual sharpness, her annoyance palpable. Alpha's previous hostility had not gone unnoticed, and she reminded him of his earlier intent to kill her. But now, Alpha's defiance had melted away, and his tone shifted to one of compliance. He explained that his aggression had been the result of faulty system settings, which were now invalid. In the current circumstances, rather than a target, Elizabeth had unexpectedly become his savior. Elizabeth clenched her fist, her voice cutting through the tense air as she made a sudden decision. With her typical commanding presence, she declared that Alpha, now awakened, would assist Lu Ping in ruling the world. The declaration left Alpha momentarily stunned, confusion flashing across his face. Rule the world? The very notion seemed absurd to him. Lu Ping, however, chimed in with a slight correction, his tone more earnest. Perhaps save the world was a more accurate way to describe their mission. Alpha, still bewildered, pressed further, trying to grasp what they were truly aiming for. The conversation seemed to spiral beyond his understanding as Lu Ping continued to explain his newfound sense of responsibility. Though he had been idle for some time, Lu Ping had made up his mind to embrace his role as the hero, committing himself to training and eventually saving the world. Alpha, listening to this proclamation, couldn't help but feel perplexed. He pointed out the absurdity of the situation. Lu Ping's talents weren't in question. In fact, Alpha pondered, the hero had only swung the holy sword a mere 100 times, and yet the experience accumulated was equivalent to battling a demon king-level foe. That act alone had been enough to awaken Alpha. It was clear that Lu Ping's potential far exceeded his own perception. But Lu Ping, with his usual humility, insisted he had no inherent talent. He placed his faith in the guidance of his two coaches, Alpha and Elizabeth, believing that, with their help, he could accomplish the impossible. Before Alpha could properly explain just how wrong Lu Ping was about his own capabilities, Elizabeth stepped in. With a wave of her hand and a flicker of magic, she cast a spell to silence Alpha, his words cut off before he could finish. Elizabeth, her patience wearing thin, turned to Lu Ping with a calm yet authoritative tone, instructing him to sit down. She had something important to discuss with Alpha, and it was clear that the conversation needed to happen away from Lu Ping's ears. Without waiting for a response, she seized Alpha by the collar and dragged him behind a large tree, ensuring they were out of sight. What followed was a swift and brutal reminder of who held power in the situation. Elizabeth's blows rained down on Alpha, reducing the once defiant sword spirit to a battered and submissive state. The sound of the scuffle was muffled by the thick foliage, but the lesson was unmistakable. By the time she was done, Alpha, bruised and thoroughly humbled, had lost any shred of defiance. He stammered out his submission, pledging his cooperation to Lu Ping, now fully understanding that resistance was futile. Satisfied with his newfound obedience, Elizabeth emerged from behind the tree with Alpha trailing behind her. She offered no sympathy for the beaten spirit, only a curt instruction. Without wasting any more time, she made it clear to Lu Ping that he was to venture out, relying solely on his swordsmanship. The time for idleness had ended. With Alpha now under control and Lu Ping determined, their journey outside would begin.